Hi, so this is the first of a series of videos about William Blake's poetry, looking at it in terms of the AQA syllabus for English literature at A level and how it fits onto their social and political protest paper. So it's worth saying to begin with that the history of Blake's criticism and the analysis of it through the 20th century, and that really became quite an industry, really, the analysis of Blake's poetry and publishing essays and books about it. That history can be divided into two parts. On one hand, you get critical approaches that focus on Blake as a religious poet and looking at his spiritual beliefs, which are really unique and different from pretty much anybody else's. And then you get the alternative school of critical approach, which looks at the political elements of Blake's poetry and looks at him as a social radical who wanted to change the world. Now, those two schools obviously are very different to begin with, but we need, of course, to look more at the political side because that's where our AQA paper places Blake. But we can also look at religion as being political for Blake, and perhaps a more 21st century view of Blake would be to say that the political and the religious are very much bound together, they're not separate at all. So we'll look at each poem in turn, or perhaps pairs of poems sometimes, and see how they might help us to answer questions on Blake on the AQA paper. And to do that, we'd start by always thinking about some of these key terms. You can see there the key terms from the English literature syllabus that they think represent elements of social and political protest that we might look at. And they include the genre, the type of text, which are broadly what you'd probably call lyrical poetry, although some of them might fit into the ballad or narrative form. The settings of the poems are going to be interesting. London, of course, is the setting of that central poem, and the one actually we're going to look at first. That's clearly what the poem's all about. So, but in other poems, the settings are more curious and interesting and slightly debatable. Power struggles are implied in Blake's poetry, whereas in some other political texts they are analysed in detail and explored in detail. It's more by implication that there's a struggle for power. And the pursuit of power and rebellion is not an obvious theme of his. However, the ruling political classes is. He's looking all the time at the people who are in charge and authority and either implicitly or explicitly criticising them. In terms of corruption, conspiracy and control, it's the two outer ones there, corruption and control, that concern Blake most. Connecting the smaller to the larger world is very much what Blake is suggesting throughout the poems, and in particular when he, for instance, writes about insects as somehow symbolic of human affairs. So he's very much aware of that as an idea. Human organisations are really interesting to Blake, not just governments, but also particularly religious organisations. The church was seen by Blake as a force of control and authority, and he disapproved of it largely. Issues around gender do appear in Blake's poetry, but they're more perhaps implicit and not as prominent as some of the other issues. Social class, again, is implied in Blake's poems. He would not really have used those terms about social class, but he's very much, as we'll see in London, concerned with the disadvantaged as opposed to the wealthy and the privileged. And then, of course, structure and language are always key to any study of any poetry. This slide also is something that the exam board has highlighted as being some key terms that you might use when you're looking at political poetry or other political texts of any kind. And so you can see those terms there, and it's worth sort of trying to use those sort of terms. I won't highlight any particular today that you could use within your analysis of the poetry to write an essay. When we think of analysis and we look at each individual poem, we're going to look at the methods the poet uses, and those are going to largely be language and structural methods. We need, though, obviously, to link the methods to ideas and to protest. So just analysing methods in isolation is a very poor technique. You need always to fit it into an argument about the ideas of the poet. And that's going to be key. And we're going to look at all our poems in terms of the sort of question themes that come up, and never just look at them in isolation. We will hone in on keywords and lines and structural elements, And it's worth making links to other poems, although that's not part of the assessment to compare. It often gives the essay that you write a sense of continuity and coherence, and it just helps you to understand the patterns of meaning within Blake's poems. And one or two of his poems really add new meanings when you pair them up with other poems. And we're going to constantly come back to his key themes. Now, here's a list of some of the question focuses from the questions that have been set up to, as I speak today, 2024. So they've asked about how Blake's poems show that there's no escape from constraints. They've asked about parents in particular and being oppressive and controlling in his poems. You see that would narrow down onto certain poems but not others. Religion equals misery is one of the questions they've looked at. And again, that would narrow down on certain poems and others wouldn't be so good for that. And that's something that we'll do as we read through. We won't look at every poem in the anthology of the Songs of Innocence and Experience, because some of them are less valuable and are going to be much less likely to be usable in an essay. Human spirit has power to resist was something they put forward as an idea, and they wanted us to analyse that. So resistance and the human spirit, though, is a bit of a questionable phrase. They said that there was no hope for the marginalised in Blake's poems, and often what they want by throwing these sentences and phrases out is for you to challenge that idea and say that that's too generic or too over exaggerated, and that there's more to it than that. They talked about personal relationships being liberating and empowering, which was not something that I would normally have talked a lot about in Blake's poetry. So that challenged readers to respond quickly in the exam when that theme came up. Are authority figures being unkind was quite an easy question, and that's all the way through Blake. And the most recent one at the point of speaking today was innocence leads to joy, which would be a challengeable idea, but very useful, I think, with Blake, and not difficult. So we're going to try to apply some of those question focuses and some of the analysis methods to how Blake's individual poems might be usable on an exam. And that again is the key here. We're not just analysing the poems as a kind of close reading exercise. We're thinking, what do you do with that poem to put it as perhaps one of your 3 or 4 maximum poems that you might refer to in detail on the exam. And it's the detailed analysis that's going to get you the marks, but it has to be in terms of the question you're being asked, not just some random going through the poem to show that you understand it sort of thing. As we focus in on the question, we then think, well, how would we use that poem to address that question? And that's the way it goes. And although you don't need to compare other poems to it, you might think other poems that might link with it would help you to make an essay that feels coherent because you're around the same kind of approach and idea. So hopefully as I look at each poem in turn, or pair of poems, you will help you to understand the poems better, but also to see how they would be useful in an exam. And we're going to start today by looking at London. And what can we say about that in terms of some of the themes? Well, starting in that first stanza, we pick out those words chartered, which is repeated. There's a lot of repetition in this poem, and that seems to be opposed to the idea of the flowing Thames, in that chartered seems to represent both laws that were imposed, like curfews and restrictions. You can't go out or you can't gather in certain groups. And there was quite a lot of that going on in Blake's time, where the government was trying to restrain the people because of concerns about mob rule and riots. There was some riots in the time just before Blake wrote this poem, which Blake was involved in London. And then the beginnings of the French Revolution happened just before he publishes the Songs of Innocence and Experience together in 1794. So that was another reason why the British government started to perhaps think about restraining the people, because they didn't want situations to arise as happened in France. So they bring laws, but they also bring charts. They map things. He didn't really like that either, drawing lines and building a city on straight lines instead of the more natural flowing curves. And what does he see? He sees marks, signs, and he repeats that. Marks of weakness and marks of woe. He marks it. He sees it in every face. And the alliteration on weakness and woe, highlighting those 2 key words. This is the picture he wants to give of London. So This is an image of a place that seems constrained. If we want to look at the first ever question, no escape from that constraint. It looks like it, doesn't it, that the people are worn down by the controls that have been placed upon them. We see here in this particular bit, the human spirit, has it got the power to resist? At this point, again, it seems not. That the weakness and woe is going to make the people of London so oppressed and so worn down by their poverty and disadvantage that they can't resist the enforced laws and regulations and controls imposed upon them by the government. The marginalised here again are depicted, the weak and woe people are surely the marginalised people here, and that appears later in the poem too. And again, we might echo the phrase from the exam that there's no hope for them here. There's not much about personal relationships or religion or parents as yet. Authority figures are implied. Their unkindness and lack of compassion is implied at this point, but is emphasised further in the poem. And, well, there's no image of innocence and there's no image of joy in this poem, and that in itself is a statement, perhaps, that innocence is what's required for joy, perhaps. And if we move into the second stanza, we get the sounds of the cries, and the cry is repeated and ever is repeated to create this sense of overwhelming noise of suffering, and voices crying out but not being heard and listened to. We've got fear, we've got that word ban, which suggests just sort of rules and things being prevented and stopped. And then that the most vivid image so far in the final line of stanza 2, the mind-forged manacles I hear. So manacles are sort of restraints like handcuffs, but possibly to the legs as well. And they're forged, made, created in the mind. In whose mind? In the mind of authority figures, presumably, who think up restraints on people. It kind of also makes us think, although it doesn't quite say this literally, of manacles in the mind, of your thoughts being restrained and restricted. You daren't even think something. And all of that is obviously images here of constraint, of control and oppression, not from parents this time, but from presumably authority figures of a national sort of status like governments. The human spirit here, again, is powerless to resist, it seems. It's been ground down and all it can do is cry in pain and fear. It can't resist. There does seem to be the marginalised here, these infants and these men crying, and they're all hopeless. The authority figures, again, are now a little bit more specifically referred to, but as these forgers of manacles. They create restraint. They think up ways of keeping us under control. And again, there's no innocence here, so there's no happiness. Now, the most unusual technique that Blake uses in this poem is what we call an acrostic. And that's in stanza 3. We can see that the first letters of each line, H-E-A-R, spell out here. And in case we thought that was somehow a bizarre accident, we can see that the last line of the previous stanza and the first line of the next also begin with that word here. So he clearly sees that as being the thing he wants us to pay attention to. Listen. Listen to what? Presumably those cries of those men and children from the second stanza. Listen to their complaints. Listen to what they have to say. And listen also to the chimney sweepers and the soldiers we're going to read about in stanza 3. So again, this is us here being told, this is the most protesty of poems in many ways of Blake. Blake is often implying protest, but here he seems to be really quite explicitly protesting. He's saying, again, authority figures are unkind and lack compassion, that there's no hope for the marginalised, that we have to fight against these constraints, but there really doesn't seem to be much escape in this poem. But listen, so I suppose that's the hope underneath, and that is where we've said there's no hope for the marginalised and there's no escape. The hope is that someone will listen, somebody will take this in, somebody will pay attention to Blake's protest here. And that obviously the purpose of protesting is always that you hope that change will come of that somebody will listen to your voice and say, oh, well, we need to do something about that. And the pressure for the change might be so great that eventually it will happen. In stanza 3, he talks about the chimney sweepers And here's the first reference to the religious element, which has been one of the questions specifically about how it causes misery rather than comfort and joy. And that seems to be the image here of the blackening church, that the church itself is blackened by the dust and soot pouring out of the chimneys, the growing number of chimneys in London as the Industrial Revolution is really starting to build pace at this point. It's also important to remember that the Industrial Revolution is still quite young in the 1790s. It hadn't been going for long, but there's an increasing sense that coal is being extracted, used for houses and factories, and that smoke is being poured out, and all the buildings were literally being blackened by that you're seeing the colour taken off the buildings, replaced by this layer of soot. But also the blackening reputation perhaps of the church. The church is appalled by what it sees and hears, with chimney sweepers, for instance, a job of great suffering and unpleasantness, particularly for the young chimney sweepers that we read about in one of the later poems. But being appalled doesn't seem to be quite enough somehow, does it? The church ought to be doing something about this rather than just wringing its hands and saying how awful it is. And the hapless, meaning unlucky soldiers, their blood runs down palace walls. A vivid image there of the who's to blame, who's got blood on their hands, the palace, the king, the government, who sent out these soldiers to fight for them and die for them. And so it's that kind of, again, very vigorous protest. You have blood on your hands. It's something that's often said by protesters against war. When they protest about governments that are conducting wars, they all say that the president, the prime minister, has blood on their hands. And that's pretty much what Blake's saying here. So vividly now, he's picking out some of the people who suffer most in this culture, the chimney sweepers having to do the dirty work of cleaning up after the bourgeois and the upper classes, and the soldiers who go out and fight on the behalf of the corrupt and foolish rulers who send them out to fight pointless wars, or perhaps to defend them against revolution, as in the French Revolution, soldiers perhaps died trying to defend the king. The final stanza is the most sort of bleak, and again it does offer this image of the marginalised most strongly, and it's about prostitutes, harlots, and they're in midnight streets. We've got this image of darkness and fear, and they're youthful harlots. That adjective there is just so punchy, really, isn't it? It really drives home the horror of what's happening here. These are young women, presumably, who are forced into selling themselves because they have nothing else left to do to make money in this sort of broken society. And they have, it seems, a cursing a newborn infant. And so the image we have here is of perhaps a prostitute who unwantedly has given birth to a child and now doesn't want that child anymore, and so takes out her anger and frustration on the child by shouting at it and giving it a terrible upbringing. And so everybody's suffering. Nobody is getting any benefit from that. Until you reach that final line with the blights which plague the marriage hearse. Now, marriage hearse is an oxymoron that combines things that ought not to sit together, really. They're opposites. It suggests that in getting married, you're going to death. And that may be because of these plagues, which would be perhaps a reference to the sort of diseases that you might catch from interactions with prostitutes. And at the time, syphilis was the deadliest of those diseases that you could catch through sexual contact with somebody who was having, probably again in those days, regularly unprotected sex. And syphilis, although now is largely curable through penicillin, there was no penicillin in those days. It hadn't been discovered. So it was a deadly disease, really horrible as well. It sort of ate you up from inside and attacked your brain, sent you mad. So the final image is of disease being spread and that everything good being corrupted into badness. So you can see how vividly useful this poem would be when you're saying, what's Blake protesting about? How is he protesting? He's saying that the world is corrupt and damaged and overly controlled, and there's no sympathy and no love and no compassion for those who are suffering, and that the people in power perhaps are indifferent to that, their subjects and their people's torments. And so, yes, there doesn't seem to be much restraint from these escape from these constraints. There's a lot of oppression and control here. It's not parental, though, it's governmental and church. It's implied perhaps that the authorities in the church are equally oppressive as the ones in the government. The human spirit seems to be really struggling to resist against these crushing disadvantages and restraints. And doesn't seem to be much liberation or empowerment or compassion or joy or innocence. It's a world gone wrong. And as such, this poem is probably one of the ones you're very likely to write about in lots of essays that you could do. All of the essays that have been set up to this point, you could use this poem within. Even the one about personal relationships and parents, well, the youthful harlot and her baby in the last stanza there, for instance, would be relevant to that. But all of the others, apart from those two, definitely have strong links to this poem that's sort of a cry out of anguish and horror at the sort of misery that he sees around him. It's like somebody walking through London and just being appalled and depressed and upset to see how degraded all the people there are. So you would take the question that you set and you'd use this poem as an example. You'd open it up, have it in front of you in the exam. Make sure you're using accurate quotations and closely reading it in detail. Don't skim over and skip on to the next poem. Give us a good paragraph or more on this poem. Yes, using the methods that are used there, some of the methods I've talked about, but only to tie it into the theme of the question. Keep going back to whatever is the central idea in the question and how you're trying to answer it. And you might be answering that question by challenging some of the assumptions in the question, and that can make a really strong argument by saying that it's an oversimplistic view. But you sometimes may be broadly agreeing with some of the things the question said too. And it's likely that it's going to be something around Blake's total distrust of any authority figure, his protest in favour of liberty, of freedom, of creativity, of imagination, and his horror at the way in which religion is misused in order to be just an agent of control, really, and not one to allow people to understand what he considers to be the truths of the Christian belief. And so London, definitely top of your list of poems to use, and that's why we've started with it. And so we could see which other poems might you include in essays alongside London. Well, lots and lots of options, some more obviously political than others, but as we go through we'll see that certain poems again will stand out strongly as being usable for the kind of themes and questions that have been set.